You trudge through the muddy streets of 16th century England, your boots sinking slightly with each step. The year is 1501 and you're walking alongside a young girl, Anne Boleyn, whose destiny is about to be forever entwined with the English monarchy. She's just a child right now, but there's something undeniably striking about her, an ambition burning behind her eyes, a keen intelligence that sets her apart. It's a quiet force, not quite loud yet, but undeniably present. But you probably won't survive this journey through history without the odd reminder that the past was, in some ways, a bit of a mess. People you'll meet here, they may look grand, but most of them are also neck-deep in political scheming, jealousy, and betrayal. Welcome to the court of Henry VIII. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. We're about to dive deep into a tragic, twisty tale, so maybe grab a cup of tea or wine, if you're more the Henry VIII type. Also, let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is at your place. I'm always curious about how far these stories reach. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Anne Boleyn was born to a noble family in the late 15th century, with a lineage that gave her access to the glittering halls of European courts. Her early years were marked by travels, not the quiet life you might expect for a noblewoman of her time. Instead, she spent her youth moving between the Netherlands, France, and England. But it wasn't just the grand courts she visited that shaped Anne, it was the people and the environment around her. Historians still argue whether these travels were purely for educational purposes or if they were part of a strategy to set her up for something much bigger. Anne's intelligence was not merely academic, it was also sharp. Political. When she returned to England, Anne had already mastered the art of courtly life, and she quickly became a familiar face at the English court, serving as lady-in-waiting to Catherine of Aragon, Henry VIII's first wife. Now, Catherine, bless her heart, had been married to Henry for years and had given him no male heir, an issue that plagued Henry's mind relentlessly. For Henry, it was a matter of royal succession. For Anne, it was a chance to step into the heart of one of the most dangerous and ambitious environments in history. It didn't take long for Anne to catch Henry's eye. She wasn't like the others. She had a sharp wit and an almost dangerous allure. Historians still debate whether Anne's flirtations with Henry were calculated, or if she truly fell for him from the start. Whatever the case, she managed to enchant Henry in a way that no one else could. She was different, strong-willed, determined, and completely unapologetic about it. These were traits Henry found irresistible. But, of course, there were other forces at play in this courtly drama. In the long history of royal courts, the idea of a woman daring to rise above the station prescribed to her is not all that common. And yet, here was Anne Boleyn, ambitious, cunning, and willing to challenge the expectations of the time. Her place in history wasn't yet carved, but she was already moving pieces into place for what would soon become one of the most infamous rises to power in history. And by 1525, Anne had gone from being a mere courtier to becoming a serious player in Henry's life. Her relationship with Henry was a roller coaster of passion and frustration, but she knew how to manipulate the political landscape. She didn't just want to be Henry's mistress, she aimed for something much more, a crown. And when you're playing at the level Anne was, you don't get to be subtle about it. The whispers began, was she using Henry to rise to the throne? Or was Henry simply so smitten that he couldn't see straight? Historians still argue this was Anne the puppet master. Or was she just as much a victim of her own ambition? But one thing is certain, Anne Boleyn was no passive player. She was shaping her own destiny, even in a world where women were meant to be seen, not heard. That fiery determination, though, would eventually lead her down, a path no one could have predicted. You feel the tension building as you step into the grand stone halls of Hampton Court. The corridors are alive with whispers, the occasional laughter of ladies in waiting echoing off the walls. But none of the chatter is about the mundane, no. Today the court is alive with gossip about the most dangerous of subjects, love and betrayal. Anne Boleyn has become more than just a mistress. She's the centre of Henry VIII's world. The king, once utterly captivated by Catherine of Aragon, has now become fixated on this sharp-tongued, ambitious woman who refuses to bend to his will. For Henry. This wasn't just a personal infatuation, it was a dangerous obsession, one that would change the course of history forever. So, before we continue, make sure you've liked the video and subscribed only if you're truly a fan. Of course. Also, share your thoughts and location. I'm genuinely interested in where you're all from. Now, back to the drama. Now, dim the lights again, settle into your chair, and let's ease back into the story of Anne Boleyn and Henry's doomed marriage. By the early 1530s, Henry's relationship with Catherine was crumbling. He had been married to her for over 20 years. And despite Catherine's strong character and devotion, she'd failed to provide him with a male heir. This, in Henry's eyes, was unforgivable. A king needed an heir. A son who would ensure the Tudor dynasty's survival. Anne Boleyn, on the other hand, promised just that she had the potential to bear him the son he so desperately craved. Or so he believed. Historians still debate whether Henry's desire for a male heir was purely political, or if it was rooted in deeper insecurities. Was it truly about the kingdom, or about his ego, either way? The fact remained that Henry was intent on marrying Anne. But there was a small problem. The Pope had no intention of annulling Henry's marriage to Catherine, no matter how much Henry raged against the Catholic Church. So, Henry took matters into his own hands in 1533 after years of frustration. Henry broke from the Catholic Church and created the Church of England. He declared himself its supreme head and set the stage for one of the most controversial acts in English history, the divorce of Catherine and his marriage to Anne. With Anne by his side, Henry believed he had a new future, one in which his reign would be secure and his desires fulfilled. Anne, however, wasn't content to just be Henry's wife. She wanted to be more. She sought power and influence that far exceeded what most queens could dream of. Historians still argue whether Anne's pursuit of power was driven by ambition or a desire for her own security. Her time as Henry's mistress had already taught her that she was dispensable. A fact she did not take lightly. But despite her lofty ambitions, Anne's time at the top was fleeting. As quickly as Anne had captured Henry's heart, the cracks began to show in their relationship. Despite her bearing Henry's longed-for daughter, Elizabeth, the king grew increasingly disillusioned. The court whispers, once focused on Anne's beauty and charm, began to shift. Rumours of her infidelity and manipulation surfaced, and Henry's affections began to wane. What had once seemed like a glorious match now appeared to be a house of cards ready to collapse. And collapse it did. But the real issue wasn't just that Henry's love for Anne had faded, it was that Anne, now queen, had no other means of securing her position than through the king's favour. Once that favour began to slip, so did her fate. Historians still argue whether Anne was truly guilty of the accusations levelled against her, or if she was simply a pawn in a much larger political game. Was Anne's downfall inevitable? Or could she have turned things around? Anne's execution was the beginning of a tragic end to a marriage that had promised so much, yet delivered so little. But before we get there, let's take a deeper look at the fall of Anne Boleyn, which came faster than anyone expected. The cold, stone walls of the Tower of London stand tall against the dreary sky. You can almost feel the weight of history pressing down on you as you walk through the prison's halls, imagining what it must have been like for Anne Boleyn. She was no longer the dazzling Queen of England, the woman who had charmed a king and stood at the height of power. Now, she was a prisoner, her days filled with uncertainty, her fate sealed by the very man who had once sworn to love her forever. Before we continue, make sure to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the ride. It's not often we get to delve into this kind of history raw, real, and ruthless. Also, let me know where you're watching from. I'm curious how far this story is reaching tonight. Now, dim those lights and let's settle back into the story of Anne's downfall. The suspense is only just beginning. Anne's fall from grace was swift. And it wasn't just the fading affection of her husband that led to her imprisonment, it was the whispers of her enemies. The ambitious men who had once supported her rise and now sought to see her destroyed. You see, Anne wasn't just fighting for her life, she was fighting for her reputation. And in the cutthroat world of the Tudor court, reputation was everything. By 1536, Anne had been queen for just 3 years, but the pressures were mounting. Her failure to give Henry the son he so desperately wanted weighed heavily on her. And while Elizabeth was a precious child, a daughter couldn't secure the throne in the same way a son could. Anne's enemies in the court, many of whom had been waiting for her to slip, seized on her weakness. Historians still argue over how much Anne's own actions contributed to her downfall. Was she truly as manipulative as some contemporaries suggested? Or was she the victim of a deeply misogynistic court that never intended for a woman to rise so high? Her enemies accused her of seducing multiple men in the court, of plotting against the king, and of bearing false charges of treason. Whether any of this was true remains a matter of debate among scholars. But in Henry's eyes, Anne had become dangerous, a political threat, a woman who had overreached, and a queen who was no longer useful. In May 1536, Anne was arrested on charges of adultery, incest, and treason. It's hard to imagine how she must have felt as the guards led her to the tower. But one thing is certain, she knew the game was up. No one, absolutely no one, survives the wrath of Henry VIII once he's set his mind on something. And once the charge of treason was added to the accusations, Anne's fate was sealed. The evidence against her was flimsy at best, just the word of men who had once been her lovers or allies. These accusations were nothing more than fabrications. But in a world where power dictated truth, they didn't need to be real to destroy her. What's even more chilling is how quickly the trial proceeded. Within days, Anne was condemned to death. The king, in his infinite wisdom, decided that the execution should take place at the Tower Green, the very spot where traitors had met their grisly end for centuries. The date was set May 19th, 1536. But here's where things get even more twisted. Anne's final days were filled with shockingly little compassion. While we may think of queens as being untouchable, in Anne's case, she was treated like any other prisoner, stripped of her dignity, her title, and her hope. As she awaited her fate, her thoughts must have turned to her daughter, Elizabeth, whom she would never see grow up. Anne had been a woman caught between two worlds, the desire for power and the realization that the very court that had elevated her could just as easily cast her aside. She had become a victim of the system she had helped create, and yet, despite all the lies, the manipulation, and the court's indifference to her suffering, Anne held one final hope that her daughter, Elizabeth, would carry the legacy of the Boleyn name forward. In the shadow of the tower, Anne's trial was a farce. The charges against her were laughable, yet her fate was sealed. Historians still debate whether Anne's death was truly about her being a threat to the crown, or whether it was a convenient way to remove an inconvenient woman. Whatever the truth, Anne Boleyn's life had come to a tragic and cruel end, but there was still one final, harrowing act left to play: the execution. The sun hangs low over the Tower of London, casting long shadows across the green. It's May 19th, 1536, and the air feels thick with dread. Anne Boleyn stands at the edge of the scaffold, dressed in a simple gown, her demeanour steady despite the horror unfolding around her. You can almost feel the pulse of history as you stand alongside her, hearing the hushed whispers of the crowd. They've come for a spectacle, to witness the fall of a queen, a woman who once held all the power in the kingdom, now reduced to this. Before we dive into the final moments of Anne's life, make sure you've liked and subscribed, don't worry. I'll remind you again before the end. It's not every day we witness history so close, and tonight, we're stepping into the shoes of Anne herself. So, take a deep breath, get comfortable, and let's continue. Now, dim the lights, take a sip of your drink, and let's ease into this final chapter of Anne Boleyn's story. As Anne steps up to the scaffold, the weight of her fate is undeniable. The executioners stand by, their tools gleaming in the sunlight, and the crowd gathers in anticipation. The scene is horrific, but there's something about Anne's composure that commands attention. She had always been known for her fiery spirit, her defiance of expectations, and her unrelenting ambition. And now, as she faces the final moment, there's an eerie calm in her movements. Historians still argue about the exact nature of Anne's feelings in those last moments. Was she afraid? Was she resigned to her fate? Or was she still holding on to a shred of hope? Some accounts suggest she made a final speech before her execution, addressing the crowd with grace. Others claim that she was silent, too broken to speak. What we do know is that Anne, a woman who had once stood at the peak of royal power, was now nothing more than a prisoner waiting for the inevitable. The execution was a cruel mockery of justice. The charges against Anne had been flimsy, at best adultery, incest, and treason, all fabricated by her political enemies. It's believed that she'd been betrayed by her own court, with men who had once adored her now turning on her in a bid for power. It was clear that the decision to execute Anne had less to do with any real guilt and more to do with the political manoeuvring of a king who had grown tired of her. And then there was the choice of executioner. Henry had ordered that Anne be beheaded with a sword, rather than the typical axe, which was considered a more gentle form of execution. But despite the king's apparent desire for a swift and dignified death, the reality was far from it. The executioner, a Frenchman named Jean Rambaud, had little experience with the sword, and the strike, though intended to be clean, was anything but. The first blow missed its mark, and Anne's neck was left partially severed. Only after a second strike did her head fall from her shoulders, a grim end to a life that had once promised so much. In the aftermath, the spectacle was complete. Anne's body was hastily thrown into a common grave, her final resting place unmarked, despite her downfall. The seeds of her legacy had already been planted. Her daughter, Elizabeth, would rise to become one of the greatest monarchs in English history. But for Anne, her final moments were nothing more than the brutal ending to a tragic story, one marked by betrayal, ambition, and the ruthless pursuit of power. But here's the thing. As much as Anne's death was a spectacle, it also set a dangerous precedent. You see, Henry's actions were not just about one woman. They were about the lengths to which a king could go to maintain control, to shape his world according to his own whims. And while Anne's story ended in death, her daughter's reign would forever change the course of history. Historians still debate whether Anne's death was truly about her political machinations, or whether it was simply a king's vengeance. Was Anne guilty of the crime she was accused of? We may never know. But what we do know is that her execution was a pivotal moment in the history of the Tudor dynasty. It marked the beginning of a new era, a reign of terror, intrigue, and power struggles that would shape England for generations to come. As the finality of Anne Boleyn's death lingers in the air, The ripples of her execution spread far beyond the cold stone of the tower. The fall of Anne was not just the end of a queen, it was the end of an era. Henry VIII, despite his ruthlessness, had made a costly decision. In executing Anne, he had eliminated a threat to his power, but he had also sealed the fate of his own dynasty. Her death, tragic and unjust, was but one piece in the complex puzzle of royal politics. And yet, it left a lasting imprint on England that no king could erase. Before we ease into the conclusion of Anne's story, don't forget to hit that like button if you've been following along. And if you're new here, feel free to subscribe. It's not often we get to walk in the shoes of those who shaped history so dramatically. Now, let's finish this journey. Dim the lights one last time. Relax. And let's take a soft step back from the brutality of Anne's death to reflect on the legacy she left behind. Anne's execution, although swift and brutal, sparked a profound shift in the course of English history. Though she never lived to see it, her daughter, Elizabeth, would rise to the throne and become one of the most iconic monarchs in history. Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, ruled England for over 4 decades, shaping the future of the nation in ways no one could have predicted. Her reign ushered in the Elizabethan era, an age of exploration, cultural growth, and stability. And though Anne's bloodline was stained by tragedy, it was her daughter who would carry the weight of her legacy into the future. The question still lingers, what could Anne have accomplished if she'd survived? Historians argue endlessly over whether she would have been a strong queen or whether she would have been doomed to fail as her relationship with Henry deteriorated. Could Anne have helped steer the English court toward a more stable future? Or would she have been another casualty of Henry's ever-changing whims? While no one can say for sure, it's clear that her death marked the beginning of a new, more turbulent chapter in the history of the monarchy. In the aftermath of Anne's death, England was forever changed. Henry VIII, though still the king, was a man whose decisions were now cast in a new light. His treatment of Anne and his later marriages would become part of the Tudor legacy, a legacy defined by brutality, betrayal, and the complex dance of power. It was also the dawn of the Protestant Reformation in England, set in motion by Henry's break with Rome and his establishment of the Church of England. Anne's death marked the end of one chapter, but the beginning of another one that would see England transformed. Despite her tragic end, Anne Boleyn's influence on English history cannot be overstated. She was a catalyst for change, not only in the personal life of Henry VIII, but in the broader religious and political landscape of the nation. She may have been executed in cold blood, but her legacy was not so easily extinguished. As the years went by, Anne's name would live on. Her daughter, Elizabeth, would cement Anne's place in history, not as the tragic queen who lost her life too soon, but as the mother of one of England's greatest monarchs. Anne's death was the spark that would ignite the Tudor fire. And although the flames of her life were extinguished, the legacy she left behind would continue to burn bright for centuries. But as we close this chapter, it's worth remembering the haunting truth of Anne's story. She was a woman who, in the end, was caught in the relentless gears of history. Her ambition, her beauty, and her intellect, all of it could not save her from the whims of a king who, in the end, cared only for securing his legacy. Anne Boleyn's story is a powerful reminder of the brutal nature of power, the dangers of ambition, and the heart-wrenching cost of betrayal. Slowly now, we step back from the tower. The echoes of history fade, but the legacy of Anne Boleyn remains. Etched into the stones and the hearts of those who remember,